Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another episode of Against All Odds. Now, today is a little bit different. Today is a solo podcast, and I wanted to come on and tell you my big why I'm so passionate about brain health, why I've been qualified as a brain coach, and why I'm going around now converting everybody's brains into being healthier, having a better mindset, and having a life of longevity that's happy. So my big why started obviously when Ben was born, so that was 2004, but it wasn't actually until 2005, when he was 7 months old, that I realised that something wasn't quite right. And the only way I can describe it is, as a parent, even though Ben was my first and he's my only child as well, that 7 months old, he wasn't moving. He wasn't I don't know whether anybody, I don't even know whether they still do these, but they read books like with the milestones and the progress. And he wasn't hitting those milestones. And his right arm, he wasn't really using at all. He wasn't sitting unaided at 7 months old. He hadn't started to crawl or anything like that. So I mentioned my concerns to a health visitor who was lovely. And she says, well, we'll get you in at the doctor's and see what happens. The doctor sent us to the hospital, and I can always remember walking into a children's kind of side ward, and they checked Ben's reflexes on his knees. And he'd got a very powerful reflex on his left knee, but there wasn't any on the right. And at that point, they thought he'd had a stroke, which was, it's something I've never heard of. You automatically think that having a stroke is kind of down to that being older. So at that point, they organised an MRI scan. And because he was so young, 7 months old, he had to be put to sleep to go in the MRI unit so he would stay still. And I can always remember taking him down to the MRI unit and the nurse saying to me, well, once you've had the MRI, we'll contact you, we'll send all the documents back to the GP and you'll get to know in about a week. I pretty much knew straight away when we come out of the MRI, because she said, I think the doctor will see you now. So it's always a bad sign, right? We were then told that Ben had a very rare brain condition, which is called a porencephalic cyst, which in actual fact is not a cyst, it's a hole in the brain. And at that point, it was the largest that they'd seen. And it took up 40% of one side of his brain. So that took up 40% of the left side of the hemisphere. So he had like 60% of his brain. That was the day that my life changed completely. It was a scary day. It was kind of a day where you'd kind of lost, the only way I can describe it is you were grieving for a life that you never had anyway. So it instantly took a different path. A path that I now know has probably been the most rewarding. It's been an honour to be a part of this path. It's shown me things that you think are impossible is absolutely possible. So on that day, the neurologist wasn't sure whether Ben would walk or talk, and it was going to be a bit of a waiting game, as in they would find out if he had any other health problems as he progressed through the years. So a little while after that, probably about 6 months, they picked up that he was partially sighted. So he's got no peripheral vision on the right side. We did think he might have hearing problems. It turns out he was just selective hearing. He's actually got very good hearing, but we did think that at one point. Epilepsy started not long after he'd been diagnosed, to be honest. But they managed it very quickly. He was put on a drug called vigabatrin, which was a new epilepsy drug at the time. And literally stopped the seizures overnight, but they returned when he was about 7 years old. And from 7 years old up until he was like 16, we'd put him on a medication. He'd be fine for a few months, then he'd have a cluster of seizures, then they'd have the medication upped, then he'd have another medication introduced, and then the whole thing just started again, to the point where he was on 3 different types of medications, 15 tablets a day. And it was in 2019 he'd had 15 seizures in one morning. So of course I whisked him off to A&E, because even though he did have seizures, to have 15 in a short space of time was unusual. And I can remember the doctor saying to me, I think we're going to have to get in contact now with Nottingham Hospital. There's not much more we can do, like with medication. So we had an appointment with Nottingham Hospital, first of all. They decided that being as Ben wasn't having grand mal seizures, he was having more the vacant type, that any operation would be too risky. So then it kind of led to a life of, right, where is this going to go? Where is this going to end? Is it going to get worse? We couldn't see a way of it getting any better. And then suddenly Birmingham Children's Hospital reached out, and I'll never forget, it was 2020, so it was when the world was in chaos with the pandemic, that Birmingham took me and Ben in for a week. So the idea was to take him off all his medication. He was all wired up, cameras around the bed, like he literally could not get out of bed for a week. He was wired up to absolutely everything. And the idea was to take him off his meds, and then hopefully they'd be able to see whereabouts in the brain that the signals are coming, to see if they could help. Now, when we got into Birmingham Hospital, I was like, oh, I don't know whether we're probably going to be here longer than a week. There's other children there that have been there 2 weeks off the medication altogether, and they're just sitting there really wanting a seizure so they can go home. And I was thinking, okay, we might be in this for the long haul. Thankfully, even though it was horrific, Ben started to have seizures about 3 to 4 days after they'd stopped the medication. And he'd had quite a few seizures as well, and probably the worst seizure I've ever witnessed. At that point, they decided they got everything they needed, and they put him back on the medication. Now, it was a strange time, because I've not seen Ben off any medication since he was 7 years old. And, you've got to think that epilepsy medication, it's very sedating. And I'd seen in these 3 days with him being off his medication how chatty he'd become. He wasn't slurring, very talkative. Like, he was asking me about the weather at 3 o'clock in the morning. He wasn't sleeping. Like, it was a complete different person. But thankfully, kind of that day, the consultant said to me, we can help you. And we had to go back. It was probably about 6 months later, where they discussed the options. And the options were the only option was to remove the 10% of that side of the brain, so Ben would only have 50% of the brain. So basically, they picked up that these signals were bouncing back and forward between the hole in Ben's brain. So if they removed the edge of it, then the signals couldn't keep bouncing back and forward and colliding with each other. So they explained that this would be a major 10-hour operation. Obviously, like with major operations, it carries the risks of death, infection, bleeds on the brain, fluid on the brain. But the positive side of this operation is it has an 85% chance of working, which is quite dramatic for any operation. It was one of those things where obviously Ben was coming up to 16, so we made the decision together. It was an easy decision for Ben to make, as in the fact that he didn't want a life of worrying about if he has a seizure when he's older, when possibly he's on his own. It was a fear-based decision, and it was the best decision. So currently we are now being weaned off medication very slowly since 2021. We are still weaning off the medication, but we are nearly there, and we've had no seizures. The 10-hour operation itself was definitely the worst kind of fear in my life, and the only way I can describe it is I knew he was in safe hands. I knew that this would be a life-changing thing for him to have done, but any parent of any child that goes through any operation, you always have that panic. And it's a very long 10 hours, and I walked and walked and walked my little legs off around Birmingham. I can't even remember how many thousands of steps I did now, but I was absolutely knackered. But it was the only way that I could stop the pure emotion of being upset. It was to walk and have coffee and to walk some more. And I'll always remember when a surgeon came out of the operating theatre. Now, before the operation, they had told me it would take Ben about 12 months to walk again properly, and he would be in hospital for 6 weeks. They also said that they weren't sure if his memory would be affected by this. So Ben's got memory problems anyway from the condition in the first place. So he's got a fantastic long-term memory, but shocking short-term memory. And they weren't 100% sure whether it would affect his memory any further. But what had happened before we'd kind of gone off to the operating theatre, Ben had said to me, can we keep the 10% of the brain in a jar? I was like, why would you want to do that? I said, well, you've actually signed it away to the science lab so they can research. And he said, I've changed my mind now. I want to have it in a jar. And I was like, oh, God. But anyway, he'd signed it over to science. But as we were walking towards the operating theatre to go in, that's what he was talking about. When the surgeon came out after the 10 hours, he said, right, because he's been under anaesthetic for so many hours, we are having trouble waking him up. If we can't wake him up, we're going to have to put him in intensive care. But ideally, we would like him on the ward and awake. So would you mind coming into the room and just seeing if you can stir him? And I can remember this bit like it was yesterday. The 10 hours of the op seems a little bit hazy. But I can always remember clear as day walking into that medical suite and Ben lying there, and my first thought is, oh my God, his head's bandaged up, he's got tubes everywhere. It wasn't a nice picture at all. But I went over to the bed and I'm just going, Ben, wake up, mate. It's over, wake up. And he'd opened his eyes slightly, not fully, but he just said, Mum, have you got my jar? And at that moment, I was crying and laughing. The anaesthetist wondered what the hell was going on. And it was purely delight for me. One, that he'd woken up, but secondly, he'd remembered. So it was just like a huge moment of gratitude for me that he could remember, which is absolutely, that memory will always stick with me. So yes, he came out of the op, he went into the ward, and we had a couple of days which were touch and go, mainly because his brain was trying to settle down and find its place. So that caused symptoms like an infection. So they did worry at one point that he got an infection, but it was purely his brain a little bit trying to settle down and a bit confused. So he had high temperature, being sick, just kind of general infection kind of symptoms. But after that, after about 24 to 48 hours, he really settled down, and he managed to come off morphine as well. which of course doesn't help sickness and things like that. On day 3, bearing in mind it should have took him 12 months to walk, he walked after 3 days. We was actually discharged after 7 days instead of 6 weeks, and he was back home. Again, it was one of those things where it's like I was so grateful to have him home, but then there was this fear as well, because I'm in my head, I'm going, well, you shouldn't be out of hospital now. You should have all the medical people around you. Still, you know, you've got all these stitches in your head, and oh my God, 7 days ago you had 10% of your brain removed, and it was all very mixed emotions, feeling grateful, kind of scared. It was all very surreal, but a life-changing moment, and up to now is going extremely well. So that was October, excuse me, October 2021. What had happened before that, in the August before Ben's operation, I'd started to get a little bit worried about Mum. So we lost my stepdad in 2019. And of course, we've been through COVID and everything, you know, everybody was isolated. But I'd noticed Mum's, I'd say, deteriorating memory for a good few years before 2019. And it was like little things, you know, it was nothing kind of dramatic. If I spoke to Mum about it, she said, I've always had a forgetful memory. And it wasn't really until COVID kicked in and we'd started coming back out of lockdowns. And you know what it was like. We, not all of us, panicked a little bit, sleep went out the window, you know, emotions running high. But I just knew that something wasn't quite right with my mum. So in the August before the operation, she had a memory test. And this test was, I think they normally do it face to face, but because of, you know, COVID and lockdown and things like that, they were actually doing telephone consultations. Now, Mum actually really flew through the memory test. I think she got one question wrong, and I can't remember what that one was, but she also got the last question wrong, where she had to count down from 100 in sevens. Now, I'm not being funny. I'm not that bad at maths, but somebody puts you on the spot, over a phone call as well, that you don't know, and asking you to do that. Even I struggled to do that. So she literally flew through the test. Thankfully, though, at the time they did say that they were going to organise a CT scan for Mum, just to double check. So she had the memory test and the CT scan done in August. But as everything, when COVID around, everything was delayed. So we didn't actually get the results to the Alzheimer's scan, the CT scan, until the January. By this time, from the August to the January, Mum had declined quite a bit. So it was things like erratic moods. The memory was getting worse. She would get upset quite a lot, which isn't like Mum at all. Mum was always very happy-go-lucky. She'd be the optimist of everybody. So it was completely out of character. So when we got to the hospital in the January, it confirmed that Mum had Alzheimer's. And at that point, Mum was like, oh, lovely. And I don't know what she thought they'd said or whether she could understand. But we got, basically, you know, she wasn't sleeping, so they gave her a medication before Alzheimer's that is sedating to help her sleep. Got given a load of leaflets, you know, like things like the Alzheimer's Society, things like that, and basically sent on our way. But again, I had a moment that I'll never forget. That same night, it was about 7 o'clock, and I noted the time because I thought how odd that a consultant is ringing me in the evening. And the consultant that we'd seen in the day was on the end of the phone and said, I think if we ran the CT scan now, which they don't do anyway, but I think we would see a massive decline even since August. I was like, right. And she said, I need to tell you, Amy, this is going to end your mum's life. I was like, right, okay. And that's something that will always stick with me. Now, in between all of this, I'll drop this in because it will understand why I'm doing brain and mindset work. In between all of these times, so 2018, I actually separated from my husband. 2019, that's the year that we lost my stepdad to a short battle with cancer. 2 weeks before he passed away, I downsized into the house that I'm in now. So moving was stressful. Getting divorced and grieving, the three top stressful things, right? All in about 6 months of each other. That year as well, I got into a relationship that we've all been there. It's a relationship that I shouldn't have got in. But I did. At the time, I didn't realise there was an alcohol problem involved at the time. But yes, I got into a very, let's say, unstable relationship. I lost a friend in about 2 weeks after I lost my stepdad to breast cancer. And I got to the end of that year and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do something for me. So I opened up, if anybody knows me before, you know that I owned a sewing shop and I was heavily involved in the craft world. So back end of 2019, opened up a high street shop for like 8 weeks, 9 weeks to be shut down later because of COVID. And there we are in that world pandemic. But we was in it together, right? You know, we all had to learn to work differently. So that was a bit of a challenge and exciting at the same time and nerve-wracking. But we were in it, all in it together. That year as well, I got engaged to the relationship that wasn't great. We'd planned the wedding for actually 6 weeks before Ben's op. But 6 weeks before the wedding was due to take place, I actually cancelled the wedding due to the reoccurring problem with alcohol. So it'd been one hell of a 5 years for me with medical issues, life challenges, shall we call them. It was all very like a roller coaster. You know, there were a lot of highs, but there were also a lot of lows. And once Mum was diagnosed, I went along to, it was called a Living Well programme. It was run by the NHS. And it was basically, it's a 6-week thing. It sounded, so it was for the Alzheimer's sufferer and the carer. So we signed up for it. When we got there, it was very much more aimed at the carers, which was understandable. And we went through all the awful things, you know, like power of attorney, wills, the care system, the symptoms of Alzheimer's. And then they also went through like causes of like things like Alzheimer's and what you kind of can do to prevent it. So that really fascinated me, because if you think about it, I'd spent 19 years around neuroscientists, neurosurgeons, neurologists, epilepsy consultants and nurses with Ben's condition. And I'd seen the brain do amazing things. You know, on paper, Ben shouldn't be able to do half the things that he does, but he does it. And I've witnessed how, like I say, the brain is amazing at accommodating. But then I've also seen the dramatic effects of cognitive decline. And I think what kind of hit the nail on the head for me is when I'm sat in the Alzheimer's Society one day, they do like a memory cafe, and you can go along, like the people with Alzheimer's and the carers can go along, and it's all very nice, and it's all designed towards the memory. So you'd sit there and they'd do quizzes of like old films and old songs. So all the people with Alzheimer's could have a sing song and chair yoga and things like that. You kind of get what I'm getting at. But one day, a couple walked in, and it was an elderly lady with a chap like my age. It turned out that he was actually my age. And your head automatically goes to, oh, he's brought his mum who's got Alzheimer's. But it wasn't. She was the carer, and it was him that had Alzheimer's. And it suddenly hit me that day that Alzheimer's is not an old person's disease at all. How I describe it is we are all capable of having Alzheimer's. You know, that's our brains like the gun, and our environment and mindset and our lifestyle pulls the trigger. So the more I got fascinated in this, I was researching. There's a lot of research going into like Alzheimer's prevention and not cure as such, but like halting the progress of Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, it'll be way too not quick enough for mum, but hopefully in the future it will be a bit of a lifeline. And then I came across brain coaching and getting qualified in neuroscience and brain coaching. And I looked at it and I thought, right, okay, I can do this. You know, I've spent 19 years around the best neurosurgeons in the country. I do know a fair bit about brain anatomy. I've worked a lot with Paul Moore. Most of you who follow me will know that. And, you know, I'm reading about this course, and I'm reading, yes, there's brain anatomy, there's brain waves, there's brain chemicals, but there's also things in there like anxiety, limiting beliefs, confidence. And I thought, you know what, this is right up my street. I've got a fascination with brains, which when I say to people, they feel like, ugh. But yeah, I've got a fascination with brains. I'd worked heavily on my mindset with all the things that I'd been through with my coach, Paul Moore. And I thought, do you know what, this course sounds right up my street. So I took the plunge. I did the course. It wasn't the easiest course at all, but I do think I had a good advantage because, like I say, I'd been around the neuroscientists for so long, and you know, heard how they talk about healthy lifestyle and thinking like that. I'd worked with Paul Moore, Master Coach of the Year, twice. He'll love me saying that, but for like 4 years, well, at the time it was 3 years. So I do think, you know, I kind of found it easier by having that life instead of me just going, no, I'd fancy doing that, and me not having any kind of experience in it. So that is my big why. What I realised massively is brain health is so important, and what's massively linked to it is your mindset, more than I ever realised. And you know, I can look back now, and I've been stressed before where it's kind of knocked your sleep pattern out. I've had anxiety, I've had my confidence knocked, I've gained a ton of limiting beliefs along the way. You know, I've been through that. And then when I realised how much it affects not only how you're feeling here and now, but actually your brain health, it was like, oh my God. And then I was learning all these techniques and this qualification of how to turn things around and not only have amazing brain health, like through your exercise, your diet, your sleep, but also triggering the good brain chemicals by our mindset, our perceptions of the world. If we're more optimistic, or if you're pessimistic, releasing cortisol and things like that. I got taught the neuroscience of rewiring habits and understanding how we go around all of our day, each day, like on autopilot. It was so much more than, just here's the brain, learn this anatomy. It combined the whole package for me. So that's why I go and do what I do now, because I massively believe that if you feel better now, that your future health is going to be better, your cognitive health will be better. If you are struggling now with, like I say, limiting beliefs, confidence, bad habits that need sorting out, bad sleep routines, anxiety, procrastination, struggling with motivation, struggling with focus, anything like that is going to lead to a bigger cognitive decline in later life. And I often believe, well, I know that if you get 10 years down the line and you start having cognitive decline because you haven't sorted your life out today, then you will end up with a huge list of regrets. A huge list. And what I say to people is, and a lot of people don't know this, but Alzheimer's actually starts 20 years before your first symptom. Cognitive decline is very, very slow. It's not like somebody flicks a switch at all. It's years of not having your sleep sorted, having high cortisol levels, with stress, being sat in fight, flight, and freeze mode for most of our lives, just repeating the same day over and over again. So we're not doing anything new, so the brain doesn't need to grow. Losing the ability to focus, everything like that. It just chips away at your brain, and then that builds up and builds up and builds up. So that's why I do what I do, because let's think about our future selves now, so that you are not kicking yourself in the future. I don't think there's anything worse than having your children look after you. I often think mum would be absolutely mortified right now, bless her, if she realised that she was having to rely on her children. Nobody wants to be an inconvenience. Luckily, she's at a stage where she doesn't realise, but there was a lot of upset in those first, I'd say, after diagnosis, a good 12 months of an upset of her realising that what she had and that she was going to get worse. Now, I'm not saying that when you work with me, like, it's a guarantee that you won't get Alzheimer's or anything nasty that's cognitive decline. But what I can promise you is that you'll get a better chance of not getting it. And for saying that 1 in 3 is supposed to end up with Alzheimer's, that's pretty shocking. So I look at it like this, like learning how to change your mindset, rewire habits, and include brain health in there, not only will make your life happier now, but it will give you a better chance of kind of delaying cognitive decline. There's an interesting study, actually, I'll mention it on a couple of my podcasts that I've been on, and one last week with Arjuna, that yes, it is true that we all have shrinkage in our brain as we get older, right? That's a given. However, it doesn't have to lead to Alzheimer's. So there was a really interesting study done, and it was somewhere in America, and I can't actually remember exactly where. It was about 10-15 years ago, and 69 nuns actually donated their brains to neuroscience, so obviously when they passed away. And what the neuroscientists found was, yes, they had brain shrinkage, And yes, they did have Alzheimer's. However, and this is the big however, they had no symptoms of cognitive decline. So they had no memory loss. They didn't have any mood swings. They didn't have, any problems where your brain's told your blood, forgotten how to work your blood, or anything like that. These people had just passed away without any cognitive decline symptoms. So it shows you that living the right life does lead to a longer, happier life where we're not a burden on other people, where we can still do things for ourselves. And it was a really important experiment. And it boiled down to the fact that nothing to do with them being religious. It was more the fact that they lived in communities. So they weren't isolated. They got outdoors quite a lot in the day. They ate a good meal every day. They ate together as well. Even when they were elderly, they were still learning to do new things. They were going out and doing the garden. They were still going out in communities and things like that. So it wasn't big, massive things that they were doing. It was very simple things that kept them healthier. And that's the thing with Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's, a lot of people think it's a memory problem, and it is a memory problem. So, but it's so much more than kind of forgetting somebody's phone number or somebody's face or where they live or anything like that. There's lots of other things that go on as well. So it's like food, for instance, the brain forgets how to chew. The brain also forgets that food needs to go down to the stomach and ends up in the lungs, which a lot of people with Alzheimer's end up with pneumonia. It forgets to tell the bladder that it's full to go to the toilet, or the other end. People can forget how to get dressed, how to write. If you think about everything we do per day is based on a memory because we've done it before, even our bodily functions. So it's a call out to everybody now. I will be doing a podcast for myself once a month, and we'll just go over things. I could talk about anything if you pop me a message, and I can happily talk about what you want me to talk about. If you want to get more involved with managing your brain health now, along with your mindset, then just pop me a message and I'll see how we can work together. It is a game changer. I've taught many people up to this date in the last year that's completely changed their lives. And like I say, it's made them happier now, which means they're going to be happier in the future. So my last thing to you is, when are you ready to start caring for your brain and your mindset? Thanks for joining me. It's a bit weird doing a solo podcast, but hey, I've done it out of my comfort zone. So like I say, I will do one once a month. Take care for now.